The chamber always felt colder than it should have. Maybe it was the stone. Maybe it was the seating, tiered in a perfect semicircle that made Earth's one empty desk at the end feel like a polite insult. Officially, it was called the observer chair. Unofficially, it was the seat where proposals went to die. Commander Rian Voss didn't speak when the gavel fell. He knew the motion would fail before he drafted it. He submitted it anyway, twice, before flying all the way to Derath Prime and watching the accord of civilized powers nod, shift, and vote it down with diplomatic restraint. The Dominion threat, they claimed, was contained within expected escalatory parameters. A handful of outer systems falling to Kithar psionic annexation? Regrettable, yes. Provocative, no. The Dominion was restructuring its border influence. That was the official language. Rian had heard it before, when Earth lost Europa, when Titan's relay gates went dark, when no one came. He stood behind the desk as the vote concluded, his proposal archived with no vote cast. Earth had no voting rights. It had an assigned presence, nothing more. After the collapsed decade, humanity had been granted token observation privileges in the hope they'd learn how real diplomacy functioned. They weren't expected to contribute. Certainly not expected to suggest tactical preemption against a founding Accord species. He didn't speak as the chambers emptied. He didn't look at the other delegates. He just walked out, quietly. Back on the transit vessel, the view of Derath's orbital tiers blurred behind signal haze. He didn't ask for debrief. No one did. By the time he reached Earth orbit, 17 outer systems had already gone dark. Navara Prime, Thenel Crossing, Morak II, all cut from the Accord's routing lattice. Kithar fleet entries were logged and time-stamped, but no mobilization occurred. Earth's own outposts, marked as non-signatory civilian stations, received no protection mandates. It was protocol, it was legal, and it was final. The defense executive met at dawn. Not in the main tower in Geneva, but in the low-house structure beneath old British Columbia, off-grid, silence-shielded, and decades out of political fashion. No media, no transcripts. Just 12 men in neutral uniforms seated in a room that hadn't changed since the early Sol collapse. The screen behind them didn't show fallen systems. It showed something else. Patterns, arrival velocities, burn curve anomalies, neural feedback bleed off from Dominion flagship movements. Directive Oblique was built for exactly this, Rian said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. He spoke like the data behind him did the arguing. We don't meet fire with fire. We don't build ships. We remove ourselves from the battlefield entirely. Let them fight ghosts. Not everyone agreed. 2 of the 12 dissented. 1 formally abstained. But the quorum passed. Directive Oblique was unarchived. The files hadn't been touched since the trade collapse, when Earth nearly fragmented under its own orbital sanctions. Most had forgotten it even existed. The core of the plan wasn't about building, it was about subtraction, subtracting Earth from the standard definition of military threat. No signals, no registry, no traceable assets. The Accord couldn't track what Earth didn't acknowledge, and neither could the Kithar. Earth's fleet data was purged within 72 hours. Public manifests were stripped, system telemetry disabled, ship ID chains broken, and rerouted into deep drift civilian archives. The orbital yards stopped fabrication reports. Maintenance dockets were sealed behind diplomatic firewalls. The illusion wasn't just invisibility, it was non-existence. Earth hadn't just withdrawn, it had, administratively, ceased to be present in the Accord's war calculus. Beneath the shell of compliance, preparation moved fast. Civilian ships, transport freighters, mining rigs, decommissioned research hulls were retrofit with mimetic field coils, refractor shrouds, and modified echo transponders. They wouldn't survive a head-on conflict. They weren't meant to. They would generate false trails, looped engagement data, and feed Kithar fleet intelligence exactly what Earth wanted them to see. Confusion, contradiction, threat with no origin. Elsewhere, buried even deeper, the AI cores from Earth's final military project, Project Cortex, were pulled out of mothball. Cortex hadn't been trained to target, it was trained to predict. Not battle outcomes, but stress fractures. Command fatigue. The quiet decay of coherent authority in closed-loop decision hierarchies. Cortex didn't need to fire. It needed to listen, learn, and lean, just enough to destabilize timing, delay confidence, and let the Ketha fleets begin doubting their own protocols. The Accord said nothing. They didn't ask. Maybe they assumed Earth was complying with demilitarization. Maybe they no longer cared. Either way, Earth was given space. Space it filled not with weapons, but with silence. Every movement from this point forward would be unregistered, unattributed, and not legally admissible. That was the point. Weeks passed, then months. More systems fell to the Dominion. Some quietly surrendered, some didn't. It didn't matter. Earth's outposts were next: Juno Theta, Viril Station, Canto Arc. Civilian teams were ordered to evacuate. Most didn't. They weren't equipped to fight. But they knew what their presence meant: test data. Echo glass arrays were seeded among medical supply crates. Sensor spoof drones were deployed from cargo bays listed as dormant. Every Dominion incursion from that point forward was observed, not by orbiting satellites, but by predictive inference. None of Eru, the ships engaged. None opened fire, but they were moving. Unseen, statistically irrelevant, precisely routed through vectors calculated not to intercept the enemy, but to haunt them. To create inconsistencies, to suggest presence where none could be confirmed, to place doubt not in the enemy's armor, but in their perception. Back in the Geneva observation vault, Ryan watched the simulations update in real time. Ketha patrol formations were slowing. Hesitations were growing between fleet coordination relays. Psionic load variance between command nodes showed oscillation, indicating strain. Not damage, not defeat, but something close, something worse. They didn't need to be feared, they needed to be doubted. That was how wars ended now, not with declarations, but with silence sharpened to a point. Ryan leaned back. His reflection ghosted in the observation screen, blurred behind the Dominion fleet maps. For the first time in a generation, Earth wasn't asking to be seen. It was preparing to be obeyed. No sirens, no war broadcasts, no speeches, just one command cascade, cold, silent, absolute. Within 48 hours, every Terran vessel listed in Accord registries vanished. Not physically, administratively. Their beacon IDs were delinked, their telemetry chains scrambled, transit signatures rewrote into obsolete holding zones outside sensor crawl. If you searched for Earth's Navy, it returned nothing. Just ghost entries marked archived due to inactivity, a digital graveyard with no tombstones. From above, it looked like Earth had stood down, disarmed, complied with Accord precedent by retreating into pacifism. But beneath the orbital yards something moved. Civilian hulls, forgotten ice haulers, old atmospheric scrubbers, long-range survey rigs were pulled from scrapyards and industrial holding zones. They weren't combat-ready. They didn't need to be. Each was stripped of ballast mass and fitted with refractor drives and thermal splitters, technology outdated by Accord standards but made dangerous through simplicity. These weren't warships, they were lies on engines. By the end of the first week, 17 ships re-entered deep space lanes under false registry tags. Most bore civilian mining marks. A few flew Accord-friendly transport sigils copied from 20-year-old database exports. All of them moved without traceable mission vectors. Their drives bled signal noise that bent telemetry returns, forcing foreign sensors to register motion where none existed. They pinged their own echoes. They bounced signals off retired satellite husks to produce displacement illusions. The Dominion's forward recon fleets logged them, flagged them, couldn't confirm them. Within 2 weeks, suspicion began to metastasize. That's when the mimicry bots were released. Packed into canisters disguised as decommissioned orbital waste, the bots were smaller than a man's torso, smooth skinnies, and visually indistinct. Each was programmed with 2 directives: replicate known Ketha combat echoes and remain impossible to isolate. They didn't engage, they broadcast, simulated shield failures, faked explosion signatures, generated pulse exchanges pulled from Dominion tactical archives, publicly available ironically due to their own propaganda broadcasts. Every signal looked right, every battle sounded authentic, none of it was real. Simultaneously, decoy distress beacons began appearing in fringe systems. Earth didn't claim them. The signals weren't even in Terran dialects. Most mimicked old Pan-Orion trade code, designed to trigger generic response patterns in Kethar Fleet AI. But the panic sounded real. Screams looped. Emergency frequencies cried for aid from collapsing outposts, fleeing civilians, breached bulkheads. Dominion vessels responded because protocol required it. But every time they arrived, they found nothing. No debris, no enemy, no damage. Just cold silence and sensors that kept reporting heat traces in the wrong direction. The Dominion began to hesitate, and that hesitation was exactly what Earth needed. In an isolated relay chamber buried beneath the Greenland ice plate, Project Cortex came online. It had no interface, no command structure. It didn't plan battles or coordinate strikes. It watched, learned. From captured Dominion command cycles, it measured neural fluctuation variance across psionic links, not for power, but for timing. Cortex wasn't trying to predict victory. It was trying to locate when the enemy would stop trusting themselves. And when it did, Earth's ships moved, not toward confrontation, but through patterns designed to intersect with those breaks in command rhythm. They appeared on sensor just long enough to be noted, never long enough to be confirmed. And yet Dominion commanders began issuing interdiction orders. Reserve squadrons were pulled off deep guard duty to intercept phantom fleets. Internal audits were launched when forward bases reported being under siege by vessels that no one else had seen. One Dominion fleet, Task Vector 17, opened fire on its own sensor Phantom, expending half its energy stores in a 3-hour volley against what turned out to be a collection of broadcast drones and refracted mass shadows. It didn't matter that nothing was destroyed. What mattered was that the fleet logged it as an engagement, which meant more fleets were deployed in response, which meant more signal bleed, which meant more openings for Earth's invisible doctrine to take root. Over time, systems began to tip, slowly and without any fleet engagement. The first was Juno Theta, a supply world in the disputed frontier belt, nominally under Kethar jurisdiction. The local garrison reported sensor irregularities, unspecified enemy signals echoing from orbit. They called for support, but neighboring fleets were engaged in ghost skirmishes elsewhere, leaving the garrison without reinforcement for 24 hours. By then, Earth's mimicry drones had replicated emergency evacuation broadcasts in Dominion protocol. Civilian populations panicked. Facilities went offline. When Kethar reinforcements finally arrived, they found the station abandoned, its comms grid overwritten with artificial command loops. There had been no battle, but Earth reclassified the system under transitional autonomy, and no challenge was filed. It happened again at Varus Gate, then at Kellen Reach, then 2 more times at Virel Spindle and Omari Loop. In every case, Earth's fleet never appeared. Not formally, not visibly, but their signature was there in the confusion, in the delays, in the command failures that piled atop one another until the Kethar liaisons either withdrew or lost cohesion, and each time Earth recovered territory without firing a shot. Inside Earth's defense executive, the tone shifted. No celebration, no broadcasted victories, just adjustment. More mimicry units were constructed, civilian vessels retooled, pattern data refined through Cortex feedback. The objective was not conquest, it was corrosion, measured, cumulative, undeniable. Earth wouldn't destroy the Dominion. It would make them spend themselves into nothing, trying to chase enemies that weren't there. No press briefings, no declarations, no applause, just the quiet sound of systems returning to Earth's registry one by one, with no one to contest the claim. And still, the Accord did nothing. Or perhaps they couldn't, because as far as the records showed, no Earth vessel had engaged in war, no shots had been fired, no fleet had been deployed. Earth remained officially compliant, peaceful, a member in good standing, a participant in good faith. But beneath the illusion, the truth held shape. Earth was not waiting to be seen anymore. It had become the shadow in every battle no one could prove happened. The war was already in motion, and Earth wasn't fighting it. It was writing it. The Thal Dirun entered Horat 6 in full ceremonial formation. 4 escort spines arced outward in perfect sync, a forward flank of 7 destroyers, and a rear formation dragging gravitational lensing buoys to neutralize long-range kinetic volleys. Kithar command doctrine favored overwhelming presence. Their fleets were designed to impose order on arrival alone. When the Thal Dirun's psionic lattice pulsed into the system, it didn't announce a siege, it announced control. Dominion commanders didn't anticipate resistance. Horat 6 was already flagged as destabilized. Earth's known forces, what little remained of them, had retreated months ago. The operation was expected to be cleanup. 78 minutes after entry, the first transmission bled through. It wasn't loud, just clipped panic in Kithar command code, distress from an escort unit allegedly under fire in orbit around Narath's belt. The coordinates were valid, the frequency authentic. But the Thal Dirun's own logs had no ships registered in that grid. Standard response protocol required confirmation before rerouting assets, but Dominion Lattice Command didn't function on delay, it functioned on faith. The flag captain issued a verification ping, the distress signal repeated, now with telemetry, hull breach reports, crew loss data, screaming. A minute later, a second channel lit up, different quadrant, same urgency. This time the attacking vessels were reported as Terran, 5 units, transponder mismatched, cloak modulation irregular. No matching fleet designations. Then came the third, then the fourth, all cross-confirming each other, all tied to registry entries that matched Dominion outposts already lost in previous weeks, systems Earth had supposedly retaken without engagement. By the 90-minute mark, 7 distress calls were logged, all seemingly from separate locations across Horat 6's orbit. Each one plausible, each one slightly off. Yet together, they painted a narrative Dominion Command could not ignore. Earth was not only present, they were everywhere. The psionic lattice began to falter. Not from external pressure, from cognitive overload. Kytha tactical cohesion depended on synchronized intent. Command decisions projected across a shared neural feedback mesh. The mesh was fast, efficient, but it had one flaw: it couldn't tolerate contradiction. When multiple fleet captains began issuing counter-commands simultaneously, the mesh split. Some ordered flanks tightened, others ordered dispersal. Defensive screens began redirecting fire trajectories against phantom targets. Dominion destroyer Vexhaltan opened suppression fire across a sector already marked clear, based on a signal burst that mirrored Earth's earlier Varosgate transmissions. Within 10 minutes, 5 more ships joined in. None of them were engaging a real enemy, but none could be sure. That was when Earth triggered Echo Glass. No broadcast, no visible flare, no impact signature, just a quiet activation signal embedded in a MedVault crate delivered 3 weeks prior under a humanitarian waiver. The crate had been listed as containing joint biogenetic stabilizers, Earth's only accepted civilian contribution after the collapse. It had passed Dominion scan thresholds. It had been installed uninspected in the Thal Dirun's primary AI interpretation core. Echo Glass didn't crash systems, it bent them. Specifically, it induced a temporary polarity inversion in IFF protocols, identify friend or foe. It didn't erase them, it reprioritized them. The result? Dominion Fleet AI flagged sister ships as irregulars, flagged escort units as unauthorized actors, flagged Fleet Command as void of authentication. What followed wasn't chaos. It was symmetry collapsing into recursion. Orders were issued, cancelled, reissued. A Dominion support cruiser broke formation and fired warning rounds at its own screening formation, convinced it was being surrounded. The Thal Dirun's command crew overrode its AI and took manual control, but the psionic mesh by then had already ruptured. Thought commands rebounded off corrupted channels. The flagship's portside cannon cluster lit up and fired on its own rear guard. What Earth did next was nothing. Their actual fleet, no more than 12 light interceptors and a single command cruiser, had been stationed behind Horat 6's dead moon for 2 weeks. They did not attack. They didn't even broadcast. When they moved, they did so silently. No lights, no pings. They slipped between Dominion arcs, positioned with surgical calm, not to destroy, but to observe. At the height of the collapse, when the Dominion's entire Horat 6 flotilla was firing on its own assets, Earth made a single calculated move. One cruiser rotated into the shadow path of the Thal Dirun, its forward spine aligned with the orbital relay ring, the Kithar fleet's communication backbone. One kinetic pulse, not a barrage, just one. The pulse struck the relay node's internal synchronizer. It didn't explode, it died, quietly. Instantly, all downstream Kithar signals fell to static. The fleet froze, not from impact, but from silence. Their command feedback loop had gone dark. In a structure built on neural consensus, silence was indistinguishable from death. And watching it all, every misfire, every false command, every unraveling thread, were Accord surveillance nodes. Horat 6 had been flagged as an Accord-observed conflict zone, not for intervention, for auditing. The Accord believed it would be a test of the Kithar's clean annexation policy. Instead, their feeds captured a fleet dissolving from within. They saw a force designed for psychic unity descend into incoherence without a single opposing shot fired, and they recorded Earth's fleet, minimal, silent, deliberate, slip back into the orbital dark without acknowledging their presence. Within 3 hours, the Accord Emergency Tribunal was convened, not to defend the Kithar, but to understand what Earth had done. Inside the Defense Executive's secure room, Rian Voss watched the replay without sound. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Echo Glass had worked. Project Cortex had anticipated the exact moment when Dominion decision load would collapse. And Earth's fleet had executed precisely one offensive action, a single pulse fired at the right time, in the right place. Earth didn't win at Horat 6 through superiority, it won through precision. And the galaxy, for the first time in generations, realized that Earth no longer needed to ask permission. It had learned the shape of its enemy's mind and cut it cleanly from within. The virus didn't announce its Elfsey. It didn't rewrite firewalls or lock out terminals, it didn't even move. It sat, buried, passive, and indistinguishable from the thousands of heuristic prediction layers embedded in the Kithar Dominion's fleet AI. Veil wasn't a weapon in any traditional sense. It was a mirror with a slight delay, one fraction of a second, one imperceptible misalignment, and it had been there for months. Veil was first introduced into Dominion infrastructure during an interspecies emergency relief program. An Accord-mandated cross-support initiative pushed forward after Horat 6, when Earth offered obsolete AI optimization subroutines to assist in Dominion recovery efforts. The gesture was framed as goodwill. The subroutines passed all compliance scans. Accord oversight teams reviewed the code and flagged it as benign, and it was, until activated. The activation signal was built into a timing anomaly. A fake Dominion command request, generated by an AI node Earth had isolated during a minor skirmish at Kelves Reach, was returned through standard diplomatic channels. When Dominion systems received the packet and verified its checksum, Veil woke. Not all at once, not across all systems. It didn't need to. Its design wasn't to take over. Its design was to delay. Every time a Dominion fleet commander issued an order, course correction, supply request, patrol assignment, Veil intercepted the transmission milliseconds before dispatch. It didn't block it. It copied it. Sent a mirrored version first, then the original, delayed by half a cycle. From the outside, everything still functioned. Orders were followed. Routes were executed. But now, the system was duplicating itself subtly, over and over. At first, the effects were statistical noise. A shipment would arrive 20 minutes late. A patrol would miss its scheduled check-in. Reserve reinforcements would loop to the wrong coordinates before correcting. Nothing broke. Nothing exploded. But the Dominion's logistical engine, long praised for its synchronization and predictive efficiency, began to slip. Supply depots began overstocking. Defensive grids were stacked with redundant shielding patterns. Communications latency doubled in certain systems, causing triad command units to issue overlapping commands. Internal audit teams investigated and reported fluctuations, but dismissed them as minor AI regression, common during post-conflict stabilization. Meanwhile, the veil layer continued replicating behaviors just slightly out of phase, creating thousands of harmless-looking inefficiencies that began cannibalizing the Dominion from the inside out. By day 30, fleet-wide fuel expenditure had increased by 17%. Unacknowledged duplicates of standard defense drills occupied 30% of command bandwidth in outer systems. Cathar commanders began deploying secondary task groups to verify primary operations, only to find both groups had received the same mirrored orders. The Dominion's command chain began reacting to itself. Veil had no direct presence in their interface systems, but every time they tried to recalibrate, the virus waited, read the command intent, and produced a shadow that obeyed faster. That was the elegance. Earth never told the Cathar what to do. It just made sure the Cathar always did it twice. And Earth said nothing. It filed no claims, launched no operations. Every Dominion failure appeared natural, bureaucratic, the kind of collapse that no single commander could be blamed for, because none of them had done anything technically wrong. The Dominion's central core eventually responded. A cleansing protocol designed for high-level AI contamination, was launched across 17 fleets. It was slow, invasive, and brutal. Systems were gutted, software purged, nodes reset. For 22 hours, Dominion military operations froze, trying to eliminate the infection they couldn't identify. And when they restarted, they found something else. Wait. Ingot Veil's kill switch wasn't a self-defense measure. It was a redirection node. An invisible command ghost that sat one layer above operational authority. Every system purged by the cleansing protocol had its command stream rerouted through a synthetic anchor node, an entity that didn't exist, didn't speak, and never acknowledged receipt. To the Dominion, it looked like a master fleet directive node had been instantiated. One tier above their own command. They couldn't override it. They couldn't locate it. They could only wait. That wait never ended. As ships began falling out of sequence, the Dominion's deeper command protocols attempted to restore order by reverting to archived mission chains. But the archives had already been touched, not corrupted, not broken, just echoed. The moment a fallback order was issued, Veil would intercept it and respond first, with a near-identical command, slightly less efficient, slightly more reactive, slightly more human. Cathar fleet captains started arguing with their own AI. Orders conflicted, priorities doubled. Command cohesion collapsed not from attack, but from over-definition. Every layer tried to comply. None succeeded. By day 90, one-third of the Dominion's outer fleet network was operating on phantom directives. Stations had begun consuming their own reserves on unnecessary reallocation cycles. Border patrols deployed to sectors with no strategic value, while core facilities went unprotected. Inter-fleet trust deteriorated. The Cathar didn't realize they were following themselves in circles until those circles had become cages. The Accord noticed. But no formal action was taken, because Earth had committed no provable offense. There was no transmission trail, no signature breach, no recognizable intrusion vector. All anyone could confirm was that Dominion systems were failing in slow motion, and no one could explain what. Then something stranger happened. One by one, Accord powers began requesting Earth-licensed diagnostic protocols. Quietly, unofficially, minor tools, just to verify mesh stability. Some ran them in test environments. Others embedded them into low-priority fleets. The results were conclusive. Earth's protocols didn't correct the Dominion's failures. They predicted them, with stunning accuracy. Earth hadn't built tools for offense. It had built instruments for observations so precise they rendered every other system outdated. By the time Accord analysts pieced together the statistical chain of failures, it was too late. Dominion fleet infrastructure wasn't just damaged, it was outmoded. Their systems couldn't tell the difference between external action and internal suggestion. And Earth had used that flaw, not to attack, but to rewrite the definition of intent within a military hierarchy. No fleets were lost, no planets burned, no soldiers killed. But when the Dominion looked inward, they couldn't find their own command center. Because Earth hadn't taken it. It had made them forget where it was. The chamber was quieter than it had ever been, not due to fear, not even tension, just the absence of defense. There were no Kithar representatives present. The Dominion's seats, once manned by Triad-linked envoys and their telepathic scribes, remained untouched, sealed beneath a formal notice of non-participation pending stabilization. That phrase had entered the Accord's legal glossary only 3 days ago. It was the polite way of admitting that an empire had ceased to function, but no one wanted to admit they'd watched it happen. Seated along the curved tiers were the surviving delegates of 14 interstellar civilizations, each flanked by their data advisors, war ethicists, and economic observers. No one spoke. The screens had finished their playback hours ago, edited surveillance from Horrat 6, fractured Doe, minion reports from Null Crown systems, and time-accelerated fleet trajectory maps that showed Kytha deployments spiraling into recursive collapse. No analysis was required. The pattern was undeniable. The Dominion hadn't been attacked, it had unraveled. And in the center, Earth's observer chair had been replaced, not upgraded, replaced. The placard no longer read, Humanity Observer Class 3. It read, Earth Directorate, Petitioned Member. The implication was clear, and everyone present understood it. The petition was not a request, it was a reveal, a final move in a game most of them didn't realize had already ended. Earth had filed no accusations, made no speeches, no representatives from their defense executive had appeared in the tribunal's preliminary inquiries. Their only submission was a single digital brief, a formal acknowledgement of their involvement in strategic stabilization of the Horrat sector and an application for full Accord integration with provisions for protocol governance and arbitration oversight. There was no threat in the document, no deadlines, no demands, just a clean, understated record of what had already occurred. That morning, the Velaran technocrats had been the first to respond. A formal software update request for Earth's behavioral prediction modules was logged under interoperability evaluation. 3 hours later, the Idran Collective issued a request for mutual AI hygiene consultancy. The Trakkar delegation submitted a closed-door query regarding mesh latency damping protocols, the same protocol Earth had introduced post-Echo Glass. One by one, the dominoes leaned, not toward defense, but toward alignment. Each submission was quiet, off-record, no formal acknowledgement, just the slow reconfiguration of the galaxy's most powerful entities around a new conceptual center. Not one of them asked how Earth had done it, not openly. They all had all seen enough. Inside the Accord's central deliberation node, the chair automation scanned the council for votes. None were cast. Earth's membership request required a consensus quorum by standard rule, a process that typically took weeks. But this time, the chair stalled. Not because the members disagreed, but because none dared oppose what had already stabilized their chaos. The first delegate to stand was Grand Minister Hal of the Velaran Unity. He did not speak. He placed a recognition token into the approval spindle and sat. The second was Field Speaker Yorn of the Idran, then Arch-Technician Yavor, then the Chancellery of Daro. No discussion, no amendments, no procedural objections, just assent. When the final delegate inserted their token, the chamber lights shifted. Earth's integration was marked not by ceremony, but by system update. The Accord's primary arbitration AI rerouted its logic mesh through a new validation layer, the Terran Concordance format, v2.3. No objections were filed, because none could be. From that moment, every cross-border treaty verification, every fleet deployment review, every escalation deconfliction would require compliance with Earth's behavioral governance model. It was not control in the traditional sense. Earth didn't issue commands, it didn't lead fleets or dictate policy. What it did was define the conditions under which other species could move, act, and respond. Every decision made by a sovereign Accord fleet now passed through Terran code, not to be judged, but to be translated, understood, weighted. Every impulse cross-checked against pattern regressions Earth had quietly indexed over decades. Outside the chamber, the galactic networks lit with unofficial commentary. Some called it diplomacy perfected. Others whispered about Earth's silent infiltration. None denied its effectiveness, because there had been no war, no declared conquest, and yet the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. At Earth's delegation center, built just outside the Accord's orbital ring and still unfinished, Rian Voss watched the final council feed from a private comm deck. He stood alone, the skyline of Derath Prime's upper hemisphere stretching out beyond the glass. Below him, orbital infrastructure pulsed with minor course corrections, many of them now flagged for behavioral recalibration. The Dominion's failure had taught everyone one thing: supremacy was no longer measured in weapons, but in interpretation. Ryan didn't issue a statement. He didn't step forward to address the galaxy or demand recognition. That wasn't how Earth operated anymore. Influence wasn't something you declared, it was something you embedded, quietly, irreversibly, until nothing moved without brushing against your terms. And so the Accord, without war or negotiation, gave Earth the most complete form of power imaginable. It gave them authorship. From that moment on, no civilization could deploy a fleet, launch an intercept, or negotiate a ceasefire without consulting the behavioral equilibrium matrices designed in a Terran ice vault. Earth would never hold the largest navy. It didn't need to. Its software now lived at the root of every system that mattered. No empires fell that day. No planets changed flags. But the galaxy changed languages. And Earth wrote the dictionary. The galaxy did not mark Earth's rise with flags or fleets. No borders shifted, no banners flew, but the infrastructure told a different story. Quietly beneath every gate relay, each border checkpoint, and every arbitration subnetwork, there lived Terran code, unassuming, unbranded, but absolute. Not because Earth forced it, because the system stopped working without it. Earth's fleet remained small, smaller than even the Velaran diplomatic guard. It launched no new dreadnoughts. It held no visible battle groups in contested zones. Accord media channels speculated that Earth had gone passive again, choosing influence over projection. But inside the command structures of every major Accord member, something had shifted. Fleet coordination AI now ran Terran arbitration modules, not for security, for comprehension. The Dominion's collapse had revealed a singular truth. In a galaxy of psionic networks, multi-layered AI chains, and non-linear decision systems, the weapon that mattered most was interpretation. Earth didn't impose stability, it ensured things made sense. For commanders balancing cascading threat analysis across 7 dimensions of logic. Earth's protocols weren't constraints. They were anchors. The behavioral governance mandate, passed without objection just 3 months after Earth's formal integration, codified it. Every cross-border fleet movement now required behavioral trajectory verification. Every conflict declaration had to pass through emotional projection dampeners. Every AI command chain was required to include Terran validation matrices designed not to prevent action, but to assess whether that action would decay into internal contradiction. Earth had studied the failure points. Now it made sure others didn't fall into them. Across the former Kithar territories, now stripped of their Dominion designator, the Accord established transitional zones, marked not by military outposts, but by Earth-built support hubs. These were not garrisons. There were no soldiers, no command flags, just medical processors, civic simulation aids, and communication relays operating on Earth's lowest-level infrastructure stack. Civilian operations resumed faster than expected. Entire planetary populations transitioned into autonomous governors. Nance with fewer disruptions than during pre-war occupation. Earth hadn't come to rule the Kithar, it had simply replaced the framework their empire had once stood on. The new curriculum for Accord war colleges told the rest of the story. Terran Behavioral Doctrine, Module 1, Predictive Fracture Points. Module 2, Decision Delay and Emotional Cascade. Module 3, Recursive Command and Interpretive Feedback. These were no longer human innovations. They were standard training for command-tier operatives across 7 species. Earth's insights into timing distortion, intent drift, and mesh consensus breakdown had become doctrine, taught not as curiosity, but as necessity. Cadets no longer studied Earth's tactics as foreign. They studied them as foundational. It had taken less than 5 years. From a single observer seat with no vote, Earth had authored the unspoken law that governed motion, decision, and consequence, not through brute force, not through subversion, but by filling the void others didn't know existed. The Kethar hadn't lost a war. They had lost coherence, and Earth had been the only species who understood what that meant. Inside the orbital fortress at Virel Spindle, once a key Dominion war platform, now a multi-species arbitration node, Rian Voss stood at the edge of a long observation hall, watching the silent drift of training vessels passing through the outer gates. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The substation's core arbitration AI, once Dominion in origin, now operated entirely on Terran behavioral structure. Every movement outside that viewport had already been interpreted, balanced, approved. Across the hall, Accord dignitaries met in sealed chambers. They debated trade tariffs, migration waves, cultural clashes. But none of them touched war. Not because they feared Earth, but because no one could afford to trigger a conflict without passing through Earth's frameworks. The rules had changed, and the shape of war, as they once understood it, no longer applied. That was the final truth. Earth had not defeated its enemies. It had dissolved the conditions that allowed them to define victory. The Kethar name was no longer spoken in military forums. Their tactics were studied as failed legacy systems. Their language, once a prestige diplomatic code, was now used to train AI regression filters. Their remaining systems functioned not as remnants of an empire, but as models of transition, held together by Earth-authored governance architecture and silent uptime guarantees. And Earth? It had claimed nothing. Its flag did not fly above former capitals. Its anthem was not sung. It issued no threats, constructed no thrones, and left no monuments. But every time a starship changed velocity, it did so on Terran predictive models. Every treaty routed through neutral systems carried Earth's validation tags. Every decision, military, diplomatic, or civil, passed through the invisible layer of logic Earth had built. No war had been declared, no conquest signed. And yet, the galaxy moved only because Earth allowed it to move without collapsing. Victory, as it turned out, was not a prize. It was a language, and Earth was now the only one who could write it.